Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another podcast from the group who set up teacherlearning.org. My name is Nick MacDonald, and I'm a teacher in education who is interested in making things better for teachers and therefore pupils in schools. That's my goal. So, Mike, introduce yourself again.
Yes, I'm Michael Bird, co-founder along with Nick of teacherlearning.org. And I think we've got some interesting things to talk about this week.
And what's that then?
Well, I'm beginning to sort of really get my head around this notion of toxic work culture. Now, we've had a lot of headlines, I know, in the last sort of week, fortnight, month or so about members of the public sector walking out and going on strike. Obviously, the rail strikes have been going on for a while. The nurses have just announced that they're going to be walking out. We've had strikes from barristers, and it looks like there are more to come, with teachers also beginning to take strike action. Lecturers were on strike this last week. So now I know that we could have a conversation about industrial action and pay, but actually I think that there's a wider issue than just pay that underlines a lot of these things, and I wonder whether it's a toxic workplace culture problem. I did have a look at this list, Nick. I want to know what you think about it, because, as I've been sort of trying to find out what it actually means, what does toxic work culture mean? It's quite interesting, really, from my point of view, is that it's a disaster, I think, if you've got a toxic work culture in a school or a university, because they are human communities. And I think the sort of potential for damage, scarring of various kinds is that bit worse than if you're just a tech company, or if you're a manufacturing company. But see what you think about these principles. I've just done a little Google search on the criteria for how you would sort of judge a workplace culture to be toxic. Okay, here we go. There are no boundaries around work. People don't trust each other. There's no room to make mistakes. People treat each other with contempt. The interpersonal relationships aren't healthy. No support for employee growth. And people frequently feel gaslighted.
So what's that? What's gaslighting?
Well, without going into a long sort of description of this, I think it's where because of messaging and often sort of types of propaganda, people come to question their memories, they question their perception of things that they experienced, sometimes even question their own sanity, because they're confused or they're anxious, because the message that they're receiving seems to be contrary to the experience that they're having. That's what gaslighting. So it's a lot of sort of corporate mottos and slogans, government policies, for example,
that don't necessarily match the reality of the
Yeah,
situation.
that's it.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Well, of that list, I mean, from a personal experience, there are two things that, well, I think these are actually one thing. The inability to make mistakes. When I started out in life, I thought, well, school is the time for making mistakes, but then obviously you don't make mistakes in life, because it's dangerous. But actually, I subsequently realized that we have to keep learning as we go. So learning and errors have to be accounted for in every aspect of life. And in some organizations that I've worked at, both in industry and in schools, I've found errors to not be welcome or acceptable, or somehow, not required. And then because there are no errors, then there's no employee growth.
Yeah.
How does that resonate with your experience too?
It does. It resonates a lot with my experience. In fact, it resonates, I would suggest, with our experience. If you remember,
Mm,
there was a time, wasn't there, Nick, when we were both colleagues in a particular setting, and in an effort to try to support some of our colleagues who, I guess the organization had deemed weak or in need of some professional development, they introduced a support scheme, inverted commas, support scheme for those colleagues, which was actually little different from a capability process.
mm,
And so, this involved raising the stakes and saying, you've got to learn this or that will happen.
mm.
And that was, I mean, this is perfect example of gaslighting, because the colleagues thought that this was a genuine attempt to help them to learn, but actually
Yeah.
what was happening to them was a capability process.
Mm,
And because the stakes were so high, and because they were being exhorted to do certain things with no training at all, it was just an action plan.
mm.
Um, they felt that it was impossible really for them to live up to the expectations that they now, irrespective of whether those people deserved, to be let go because they were weak. I mean, it felt to a lot of us who weren't going through those processes that it seemed aggressive, and and in every case, the emotional uh, you know implication of going through a process like this took over from actually any form of professional learning. For me, that's a perfect example of something that was toxic, something actually that was done to hound people out, of an organization, rather than deal with the fact that some of these colleagues are having difficulty with something which maybe they could do with some training on, or that maybe the whole school or the whole organization could learn something from.
Which seems a bit
Um,
strange because the one thing you would expect in a school is that the learning process should apply to the staff as well as the pupils.
Absolutely.
But it did appear in that circumstance that we both understood that it was very much a matter of poor support.
Yeah.
But I do want to just challenge you on one thing. I
Yeah.
mean, what could they have done that was different to what they actually did do that would have made a difference, do you feel?
Well, yes, and that's a good question. And obviously, this was a feature. This sort of support process was a feature of a work culture that had become toxic. Now that means that you don't address the problem by just getting rid of the support process policy. You've got to do something about the work culture more widely. And personally, I think this is what we're all about, isn't it? This is what teacherlearning.org is trying to do, is to
Yes.
professionalize people by sort of inspiring them to think about all of the possible evidence, data, learning that they could access to explain situations that seem to be happening, particularly situations that seem to be repeating themselves on a day-to-day or weekly basis in one's practice, and therefore what you can do to overcome that. Surely the job of management in a school is to facilitate that process, but only by doing that can you can you get sort of rid of this sort of gaslighting, contemptible, horrible, not collective, not cooperative, toxic work culture. I mean, it
Oh,
comes back to this thing as well, Nick, is how, I mean, I've got two children who are both now in high school, and and I have to say I'm very pleased, very happy with the high school. I love the way that they support those children. So I'm not criticizing the high school, but there's no question they hate going to school. They really don't like it, and it's not because they don't learn anything from it. It's because the relationships that they have with their co-pupils are incredibly stressful. They cause a really high level of stress. They're non-cooperative. There's a lot of contempt. There's a lot of sort of microaggression, and actually less microaggression. There's really difficult circumstances that they have to encounter every day when they go into school. That's a problem.
What should the schools do? I mean, what can the schools do? What should the schools do?
Yeah, I mean, this comes back to what a happy organization versus an unhappy organization is like. I mean, I'm convinced, and I know for a fact, that there are schools that are happy places. I would go so far as to say that the school you're at currently, Nick, looks like it's doing well. It seems to be a happy, thriving place. Of course, there's problems with resourcing at the moment. There's problems with public sector pay. There's problems with industrial relations and all of that. But despite all of that, it sounds to me like the school that you're currently at is a school that gets it right. And therefore it is possible, in a climate of challenge, which all schools, all educational organizations have at the moment, it is possible to not go down the path of making your work culture toxic. So therefore, I think we need to figure out a little bit more about what that is. I mean, I suppose we could go back to the podcast we did a number of weeks ago about the place that you're at, Nick, and it's Rudolf Steiner, a sort of background. I mean, that might have something to do with it. And it's not as simple as just taking that model and then rolling it out across everywhere.
No.
You have to take a series of principles, but a lot of these principles are about leadership, aren't they? I mean,
yes.
The Good to Great book, I think, has a very good suggestion about the kind of principles that should underpin not just successful organizations, but happy ones.
Yes, it does. In fact, there are two books there, and I'll reference them both in the info below. I'm also going to put a link below, which you'll find there now, about a TED talk from Eduardo Briceño, who talks about how you've got to make an environment conducive to learning by allowing the making of mistakes and deliberate practice to get better at everything. And that's we're not just talking about pupils here, or he said he was talking about the workplace. So this applies directly to everything that you're talking about. So I think what you're saying is that it's not about one size fits all. It's not about applying either the system under which I work or the system under which we've worked before, or any other system, to one particular school. It is exploring that word leadership and making it fit for purpose in the organization, whether it's a school or anything else, to avoid these things which on this list of 7 toxic things that you mentioned earlier. That seems to be the key.
Well, yeah, and these are not a roadmap. It's not a blueprint, but they are a set of principles that requires. I mean, it's a lofty challenge for leaders in an environment like this to facilitate, a productive and a happy workplace environment. But it is possible. There are people who are in them, and just like everything, we can learn things from it. Doesn't mean that we just take everything out of that context and apply it elsewhere.
Of course, yes.
So there will be some blog posts about this coming up, where I'm quite interested in exploring this notion a little bit more. It helps me to sort of recalibrate, reconfigure, maybe reinterpret some of my own experiences as a colleague earlier on in my own career.
Very good. I think we need to crack on with those with those blog posts very soon. I think, but I think this is something we've got to pursue because it's people's life chances are at risk here when things go wrong for them in education. Excellent. Thank you very much, Mike. So
Thank you, Nick.
we shall see you again on the next podcast.
Okay, take care. Bye.
Cheers. Bye.